November 26, 1942. Jiangwan Military Prison, Shanghai, Japanese-occupied China. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, B-25 bombardier from the USS Hornet's Doolittle raid, woke to something he hadn't smelled in 7 months. Roasted meat. The scent drifted through the concrete corridors where 8 American airmen had been held since their capture on April 18th. Hayes sat up on his wooden platform. Through the barred window, gray November light filtered into the cell he shared with Lieutenant William Farrow and Sergeant Harold Spatz. Both men were already awake, staring at the door. "You smell that?" Farrow whispered. Hayes nodded. In 7 months of captivity, they'd received rice, weak soup, and occasional vegetables. Nothing more. The aroma of roasted chicken, or was it duck, seemed impossible. Footsteps approached, not the usual morning guard rotation. These steps were measured, deliberate. The cell door opened. A Japanese officer Hayes had never seen before stood in the doorway, mid-40s, Western-educated accent, immaculate uniform. Behind him, 3 guards carried trays. "Gentlemen," the officer said in perfect English, "Happy Thanksgiving." Robert Hayes, 25, had grown up in Terre Haute, Indiana. His father managed a grain elevator. His mother taught Sunday school. Hayes had enlisted in Army Air Forces in January 1941, trained as a bombardier at Lowry Field in Colorado, and volunteered for an extremely hazardous mission in February 1942. That mission became the Doolittle Raid. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from USS Hornet on April 18, 1942, striking Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya. First American strike against the Japanese homeland. Hayes's aircraft, piloted by Captain Edward York, had run critically low on fuel after the bombing run. York made the decision to divert to Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, rather than attempting the planned landing in China. The Soviets, technically neutral with Japan, interned the crew. But in June 1942, Soviet authorities secretly transferred Hayes and 7 other Doolittle Raiders to Japanese forces near the border. The handover was unofficial, deniable, and devastating. Since June 1942, Hayes had been moved through 3 different facilities. Jiangwan Military Prison in Shanghai became their final stop in September. Here, the interrogations intensified. The Japanese wanted bomber tactics, carrier procedures, American industrial capacity. They wanted to understand how the impossible raid had succeeded. Hayes and his fellow prisoners had given nothing: name, rank, serial number, standard responses. Silence. Until November 26, when the officer who introduced himself as Commander Watanabe brought Thanksgiving dinner. Japanese military intelligence had a problem. 8 American bomber crewmen held critical operational knowledge. Standard interrogation techniques, isolation, deprivation, occasional violence, had produced nothing useful in 7 months. The prisoners knew carrier launch procedures for medium bombers, modified B-25 specifications for carrier operations, American industrial capacity at North American Aviation, training methods at Eglin Field, Florida, communication protocols between Army, Air Forces, and Navy. Every captured document indicated these specifications. Every strategic analysis confirmed their importance. Yet the Americans refused to speak beyond basic identification. Traditional interrogation had failed. Physical coercion violated international law and risked American retaliation against Japanese prisoners. The POWs were too valuable to execute immediately. Their knowledge outweighed propaganda value of public trials. Commander Watanabe had studied at Stanford University from 1931 to 1933. He understood American psychology better than most Japanese officers. He proposed an alternative approach: Nostalgia, interrogation. Americans are sentimental about holidays, Watanabe had argued to his superiors at Shanghai Area Army headquarters. Thanksgiving especially. Give them familiar food, remind them of home, lower their psychological defenses. They'll talk about family, then tactics, then operations. His superiors approved one attempt, November 26, 1942, American Thanksgiving. The trays held roasted duck, rice with vegetables, pickled radishes, and small cups of sake, more food than Hayes had seen in 7 months combined. The portions were reasonable, not excessive enough to suggest obvious bribery, but substantial enough to feel like genuine hospitality. Watanabe gestured to the guards who set the trays on the floor and departed. The officer remained standing near the door. "I studied in California," Watanabe said conversationally. "I remember Thanksgiving at my host family's home in Palo Alto. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce. Your mother made cranberry sauce, Lieutenant Hayes?" Hayes said nothing. He hadn't mentioned his mother to anyone since capture. How did Watanabe know? "We have your personal effects from the aircraft," Watanabe continued. "Letters in your flight jacket pocket. Your mother writes beautifully. She mentioned teaching you to make cranberry sauce when you were 12. Standard interrogation manual, Hayes realized. Demonstrate knowledge of personal details to establish psychological dominance. Make the prisoner feel exposed, vulnerable, lower resistance through false intimacy. But the food was real. The smell was overwhelming. "Eat," Watanabe said. "Consider it a gesture between warriors. We respect the courage your mission required. Today, we honor that courage." Pharaoh looked at Hayes. Spatz stared at the duck. 7 months of near starvation made refusing almost impossible. Hayes made a calculation. Accept the food, refuse the conversation. Let Watanabe waste his strategy on full stomachs and closed mouths. "Thank you, Commander," Hayes said. Nothing more. They ate in silence. Watanabe watched, saying nothing for several minutes. The duck was excellent, likely prepared in Shanghai's French concession by chefs who understood Western cuisine. Each bite felt like psychological warfare. When they finished, Watanabe pulled a small wooden stool from the corridor and sat near the cell bars. "Your mission was remarkable," he said. "Launching B-25 medium bombers from an aircraft carrier. Every expert said it was impossible. The Army Air Forces said Mitchell bombers needed 3,000 feet of runway. USS Hornet's deck provided 450 feet. Yet you launched successfully. How?" Hayes recognized the technique. Start with open admiration. Acknowledge the prisoner's accomplishment. Appeal to professional pride. Get them talking about technical details. Slide from engineering into tactics, from tactics into strategic planning. "Name, rank, serial number," Hayes said. "Of course," Watanabe replied smoothly. "I expected nothing less. But consider this, Lieutenant. The war will end eventually. Perhaps in Japan's victory, perhaps in negotiated peace. When it ends, historians will want to understand the Doolittle Raid. American historians, Japanese historians, neutral observers. They'll want the truth about how 16 bombers launched from a carrier deck and struck our homeland. Don't you want that truth recorded accurately?" Clever, Hayes thought. Appeal to historical legacy. Suggest that providing technical details serves a higher purpose than intelligence gathering. Reframe cooperation as preserving accurate history rather than betraying tactical secrets. "I'd prefer historians recorded after the war," Hayes said, "when I can speak freely." Watanabe smiled slightly. "Fair enough." The interrogator stood, retrieved his stool, and moved toward the door. But before leaving, he turned back. "One last question, Lieutenant. Not about tactics or procedures, just a cultural curiosity. What does Thanksgiving mean to you? What is it your people celebrate with this holiday? The question seemed innocuous. Hayes considered refusing to answer, but 7 months of silence had been exhausting, and perhaps one answer, carefully constructed, might establish rapport without providing intelligence value. Gratitude, Hayes said. We celebrate gratitude for survival, for harvest, for community. Interesting, Watanabe said. We have similar harvest festivals. Perhaps our cultures aren't so different. He left. The door locked behind him. Pharaoh waited until the footsteps faded, then spoke quietly. He'll be back. Tomorrow, Hayes agreed, with more questions, more food maybe, building rapport. What do we do? Hayes looked at the empty trays. His stomach felt full for the first time since April. The sake had warmed him pleasantly. Every part of the strategy had worked exactly as Watanabe intended, except the conversation. We answer what doesn't matter, Hayes said. We give him history, not tactics. Culture, not operations. Make him think we're cooperating without actually telling him anything useful. That's a dangerous game, Spatz said. What if we slip? What if he tricks us into revealing something real? Then we stop talking immediately, Hayes replied. But if we refuse everything, he'll try different methods, harsher methods. This way we control the conversation. We decide what he hears. It was a gamble, but 7 months of absolute silence had gained them nothing except hunger and isolation. Perhaps controlled conversation, carefully scripted, deliberately misleading, might work better. The next morning, Watanabe returned. November 27, 1942, 0900 hours. Watanabe brought no food this time, just a wooden chair, a notebook, and a fountain pen. He sat outside the cell bars, opened the notebook, and smiled. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, he said, about gratitude and harvest. In Japan, we celebrate similar themes during rice harvest season. But your Thanksgiving has a specific origin story, doesn't it? Plymouth Colony, 1621. Pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a feast. Hayes said nothing. The historical detail was common knowledge, nothing secret about Thanksgiving's origins. I find that story fascinating, Watanabe continued. 2 cultures, recent enemies, choosing to share food and celebrate survival together. Rather like our situation yesterday, wouldn't you say? Ah, Hayes thought. Here comes the comparison. He wants us to see ourselves as modern pilgrims, sharing a feast with former enemies. Psychological manipulation wrapped in historical metaphor. The difference, Hayes said carefully, is that the pilgrims chose to be there. We didn't choose captivity. True, Watanabe acknowledged. But perhaps you chose the mission that brought you here. You volunteered for the Doolittle Raid, Lieutenant. You knew the risks. Name, rank, serial number. Watanabe made a note in his book. Let's try a different approach. You mentioned gratitude yesterday. What are you grateful for today, Lieutenant Hayes? Here, in this cell, in Shanghai, in Japanese custody. What brings you gratitude? The question seemed designed to provoke either anger or despair. Hayes considered refusing to answer, but then he saw the opportunity. I'm grateful my crew survived the bailout, Hayes said. I'm grateful we didn't crash into the Pacific. I'm grateful we're being held according to international law as prisoners of war. The last statement was deliberate provocation. All 8 Doolittle Raiders held in Shanghai knew their status remained legally ambiguous. Japan had never declared them prisoners of war. They existed in bureaucratic limbo, captured combatants with no formal protection. Watanabe's smile faded slightly. Your gratitude may be premature, Lieutenant. Your status is still under review by Tokyo. The raid violated international law, attacking civilian targets without declaration of war. You may be tried as war criminals rather than held as prisoners of war. We bombed military and industrial targets, Hayes replied. Tokyo Bay shipyards, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, aircraft factories. Legitimate military objectives. You also bombed residential areas. Collateral damage, same as Japan created in China, in the Philippines, in Singapore. Watanabe's jaw tightened. Hayes had struck a nerve. Japanese military actions in China since 1937 remained a sensitive topic. Let's return to technical matters, Watanabe said, his tone cooling. The B-25 Mitchell bomber.
How was this accomplished?
Hayes recognized the shift in tactics. Watanabe had abandoned rapport building and moved to direct technical interrogation. The Thanksgiving feast strategy had failed. Now came harder questions. Name, rank, serial number, Hayes said. Lieutenant, we already know most of the modifications. We recovered aircraft wreckage in China. We examined the engines, the fuel systems, the bomb racks. We know about the additional fuel tanks. We know about the weight reduction, removing lower gun turret, reducing crew size. What we don't understand is the launch technique itself. What procedure allowed successful takeoff from such a short deck? Hayes said nothing. The question was too specific, too operational. Any answer would confirm Japanese technical intelligence about carrier modifications and launch procedures. Watanabe leaned forward. Consider this, Lieutenant. We will eventually extract this information. If not from you, then from examination of captured aircraft. If not from aircraft, then from other prisoners. Your cooperation now would earn you better treatment, better food, medical care for Sergeant Spatz's injury. Hayes glanced at Spatz, who had fractured his collarbone during the bailout. Japanese doctors had said it poorly. Spatz carried his left arm awkwardly, clearly in pain. The offer was tempting. Admit what Japan would discover anyway. Buy better conditions with inevitable information. Trade technical details for medical care. But Hayes knew the game. Give them aircraft modifications, they'd ask about carrier procedures. Give them carrier procedures, they'd ask about communication protocols. Give them protocols, they'd ask about future operations. Each answer would justify the next question until they'd extracted strategic intelligence that could cost American lives. Name, rank, serial number, Hayes repeated. Watanabe stood abruptly. Very well, Lieutenant. Enjoy your rice and soup. I'll return tomorrow with different questions. Perhaps your friends in the other cells will be more cooperative. He left. The door locked. Pharaoh exhaled slowly. He's going to try the others. Let him, Hayes said. We briefed everyone. Nobody talks. But doubt crept into Hayes's mind. 8 men, isolated in separate cells, subjected to individual interrogation. Would everyone maintain silence? Or would someone crack under pressure, believing their technical knowledge had already been compromised? The next morning brought no visit from Watanabe, no interrogation, no food beyond the usual rice and weak soup. The morning after that, nothing. For 3 days, Watanabe vanished. The silence felt calculated, a psychological technique to make prisoners anxious about what might be happening to their fellow captives. On December 1st, Watanabe returned with guards carrying trays of food. Better than rice, but not as elaborate as Thanksgiving. Steamed fish, vegetables, hot tea. Sergeant Dean Hallmark sends his regards, Watanabe said pleasantly, mentioning the pilot held in a different cell block. He was quite cooperative yesterday, confirmed several technical details about B-25 modifications, weight reduction, fuel capacity, engine adjustments for short takeoff. Very helpful. Hayes felt his stomach drop. Had Hallmark actually talked, or was this another psychological game, claiming cooperation to pressure Hayes into confirming details Watanabe had merely guessed? I don't believe you, Hayes said. Believe what you like, Watanabe replied, but consider why I would lie. If Hallmark had refused to cooperate, I would be here threatening you. Instead, I'm offering you the same opportunity. Speak honestly about technical matters. Receive better treatment. Hayes made a decision. Call the bluff. If Hallmark told you about weight reduction and fuel capacity, then you already know everything about the aircraft modifications. You don't need confirmation from me. Watanabe's expression didn't change. True, but I still need operational details. How did your crew practice carrier takeoffs? Where did training occur? What communication protocols did Colonel Doolittle establish? There it was, the progression Hayes had anticipated. Technical details about aircraft led to operational questions about training and procedures. Watanabe had either extracted or guessed aircraft modifications. Now he wanted the human systems, training methods, communication protocols, coordination procedures, information that would directly help Japan defend against future carrier raids. Name, rank, serial number, Hayes said. Watanabe's pleasant expression finally cracked. Lieutenant, you are trying my patience. Your fellow prisoners are cooperating. Your obstinacy serves no purpose except prolonging your suffering. Then let me suffer, Hayes replied. The interrogator stood, leaving the food trays. Eat. Consider your position. Tomorrow I return with documents that will prove Hallmark's cooperation. Then you'll understand how isolated your resistance has become. He left. Hayes, Farrow, and Spatz stared at the food. Think Hallmark actually talked? Spatz asked. No, Hayes said. If he had, Watanabe wouldn't need us. This is theater. He wants us doubting each other. But privately, Hayes wasn't certain. 7 months of captivity, poor food, isolation, men broke under less. Maybe Hallmark had decided technical details didn't matter. Maybe he'd traded aircraft specifications for better treatment, believing the information would emerge eventually from wreckage examination. The next morning, December 2nd, Watanabe arrived with a Japanese officer Hayes recognized, Major Sawada, the judge advocate who had briefly interviewed all prisoners in October regarding their legal status. Sawada carried a folder of documents. He opened it, removed several pages covered in handwriting, and held them up for Hayes to see through the bars. Sergeant Hallmark's statement, Sawada said in heavily accented English. Signed yesterday. Describes B-25 modifications in detail. Confirms training at Eglin Field, Florida. Identifies Colonel Doolittle's communication procedures with Navy carrier commanders. Everything. Hayes scanned the pages quickly. The handwriting looked authentic, rushed, uneven, possibly written under stress. The content was detailed, technical, operationally specific. His heart sank. Hallmark had broken. Now, Watanabe said quietly, will you cooperate? Or will you maintain this pointless silence while your friends make rational decisions? Hayes felt the trap closing. If Hallmark had genuinely provided detailed information, then Hayes's continued silence gained nothing. The intelligence had already been compromised. Confirming details Watanabe already possessed wouldn't worsen the situation. But if this was an elaborate deception, forged documents, false claims, then any confirmation would validate lies and provide Japan with operational intelligence they didn't actually possess. Hayes made his choice. I'd like to speak with Sergeant Hallmark, he said, face to face. If he's willing to confirm these statements in person, I'll consider answering your questions. Watanabe and Sawada exchanged glances. The request was reasonable, too reasonable to refuse without exposing the deception. That can be arranged, Watanabe said after a pause. Tomorrow morning, you and Hallmark will meet in the interrogation room. If he confirms his cooperation, you will cooperate as well. Agreed? Agreed, Hayes lied. December 3, 1942, 08:30 hours. Guards escorted Hayes to a small room on the second floor of Jiangwan Prison. Concrete walls, one barred window, a wooden table with 2 chairs. Watanabe stood near the door. Major Sawada sat at the table with his folder of documents. 5 minutes later, guards brought in Sergeant Dean Hallmark. Hayes had seen Hallmark briefly during their initial capture in June, but not since their separation into individual cells. The pilot looked thinner, exhausted, but alert. His eyes met Hayes's with warning intensity. "Sergeant Hallmark," Watanabe said formally, "please confirm for Lieutenant Hayes the statement you provided yesterday regarding B-25 modifications and training procedures." Hallmark looked directly at Hayes. "I told them nothing." Watanabe's face flushed. "Sergeant, this is not helpful. We have your signed statement." "You have forged documents," Hallmark interrupted. "I signed nothing. I said nothing except name, rank, and serial number. Whatever papers you're showing Lieutenant Hayes are fabrications designed to make him think I cooperated." Sawada slammed his hand on the table. "You are lying to protect yourself. You provided detailed technical information in exchange for medical treatment." "I received no medical treatment," Hallmark said calmly. "I've been given the same rice and soup as everyone else. No special privileges. No cooperation." Hayes felt relief flood through him. Hallmark hadn't broken. The documents were forgeries. The entire elaborate setup, Thanksgiving dinner, psychological pressure, claims of cooperation, had been theater designed to fracture group cohesion. Watanabe recognized that the game was over. His expression hardened from pleasant interrogator to frustrated intelligence officer. "Remove them," he ordered the guards. "Separate cells. No contact." As guards grabbed Hayes and Hallmark, the 2 airmen locked eyes one final time. Hayes saw determination there, stubborn, absolute refusal to yield. Back in his cell, Hayes explained what had happened to Farrow and Spatz. "So the Thanksgiving feast was what?" Farrow asked. "Just an opening move." "Exactly," Hayes said. "Lower our defenses with nostalgia and good food. Make us comfortable. Then apply pressure. Isolation, claims of others cooperating, forged documents, standard interrogation escalation." "What happens now?" Spatz asked. Hayes considered the question. Watanabe's soft approach had failed completely. The interrogator had exhausted rapport building, psychological pressure, and deception tactics. Standard interrogation protocols suggested 2 possible next steps: abandonment or escalation. Abandonment would mean accepting that the prisoners wouldn't cooperate. Intelligence value would be extracted only from captured equipment and documents. The prisoners would be held in routine custody pending either exchange or trial. Escalation would mean harsher methods, potentially torture, though Japan theoretically observed international law regarding prisoners of war. More likely, reduced rations, harsher isolation, threats against other prisoners. "I think we see less food," Hayes said. "Worse conditions. They'll punish us for non-cooperation, but they won't risk killing us. We're too valuable as potential exchange subjects or propaganda tools." He was wrong. December 10, 1942. Guards arrived at dawn and removed Hayes, Farrow, and Spatz from their cell. They were marched to a larger room where 5 other Doolittle Raiders waited: Dean Hallmark, Robert Metter, William Farrow, George Barr, and Jacob DeShazer. Major Sawada stood at the front of the room with an interpreter and several Chinese civilians, lawyers or observers, Hayes guessed. "You have been charged with crimes against the Japanese people," Sawada announced through the interpreter. "Indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya, violation of international law, murder of non-combatants." Hayes felt his blood run cold. This wasn't a continuation of interrogation. This was a military tribunal. Over the next 3 hours, Sawada presented evidence, documents about the Doolittle Raid, photographs of bomb damage in Japanese cities, testimony from Japanese officials claiming civilian casualties. The Chinese lawyers asked no questions and raised no objections. The process was entirely procedural, entirely predetermined. At 1400 hours, Sawada delivered the verdict: death by firing squad for all 8 prisoners. Hayes heard the words but couldn't process them. After 7 months of interrogation, isolation, and psychological pressure, Japan had decided that non-cooperative prisoners of war had no value except as examples. Guards removed them back to their cells. Hayes's mind raced through possibilities. Appeal to international law? Contact the International Red Cross? Send messages through neutral countries? But Shanghai was deep in Japanese-occupied territory. No neutral observers existed. No appeals process. No international oversight. On December 14th, guards came for Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz, the pilot and 2 gunners from Hayes's original crew. Hayes watched through the cell window as they were led to a courtyard. Rifle fire echoed 30 minutes later. 3 executed, 5 spared. Hayes would learn months later that Emperor Hirohito had personally commuted 5 death sentences to life imprisonment, apparently concerned about American retaliation against Japanese prisoners. The emperor's mercy was arbitrary. Hayes survived because he was bombardier rather than pilot, because he was young, because Tokyo needed potential exchange subjects. Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz died because Japan wanted to demonstrate the consequences of refusing to cooperate. The Thanksgiving feast, the psychological games, the forged documents, all of it had been leading to this moment. Watanabe hadn't been trying to extract tactical intelligence. He'd been building a legal case for execution. Demonstrate that prisoners refused cooperation, justify harsh punishment, establish precedent that captured American airmen faced death rather than internment. Hayes spent the rest of the war in various Japanese prison camps. He endured dysentery, malnutrition, and continued interrogation attempts. He maintained silence on tactical matters but occasionally shared cultural information, stories about American holidays, descriptions of civilian life, anything that seemed innocuous but might remind his captors that prisoners were humans, not intelligence resources. In August 1945, Soviet forces liberated Hayes from a camp in Mukden, Manchuria. He weighed 92 pounds. He had survived 3 years and 4 months of captivity. He returned to Terre Haute in September 1945 to find that his mother had kept his letters in a wooden box on the kitchen table, reading them every Thanksgiving. She had made cranberry sauce every November 26th since 1942. Setting an empty place at the table for her son. The Thanksgiving interrogation technique spread through Japanese military intelligence operations, appearing in modified form at POW camps across the Pacific Theater. Intelligence officers tried similar approaches: Christmas celebrations for captured Marines at Wake Island, birthday parties for prisoners in the Philippines, cultural festivals for Australian POWs in Singapore. The results were mixed. Some prisoners accepted the gestures as genuine kindness and lowered their psychological defenses. Others recognized the manipulation immediately and maintained silence. A few provided false information deliberately, feeding interrogators misleading tactical details that sounded plausible but had no operational value. American military intelligence learned about the technique through debriefings of liberated prisoners. The pattern emerged clearly. Japan used cultural nostalgia as an interrogation tool, believing American sentimentality about holidays made prisoners vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Post-war analysis by Army intelligence officers concluded that the technique was moderately effective against isolated individuals but largely failed against organized groups. When prisoners could communicate with each other, even briefly, even non-verbally, they coordinated resistance strategies and recognized manipulation patterns. The Doolittle Raiders' resistance became a case study in military intelligence training. 8 men, isolated in individual cells, subjected to sophisticated psychological pressure, facing death sentences, yet they maintained operational silence. Their refusal to cooperate cost 3 lives but protected tactical intelligence that Japan desperately wanted. Hayes's decision to call Watanabe's bluff about Hallmark's cooperation became a teaching example. Verify claims before accepting them. Demand proof of others' cooperation. Maintain group solidarity even under isolation. The technique influenced Cold War interrogation resistance training. Military survival schools began teaching soldiers to recognize nostalgia-based manipulation, to resist offers of comfort food and familiar cultural experiences, to maintain psychological distance from interrogators who seemed friendly and understanding. Commander Watanabe's report to Shanghai Area Army headquarters in December 1942 acknowledged complete failure. 8 prisoners had resisted 7 months of interrogation. The Thanksgiving strategy had produced no tactical intelligence. The subsequent tribunal and executions had eliminated potential sources without extracting operational value. Western-educated interrogation approaches are insufficient, Watanabe wrote. American military personnel demonstrate unexpected resistance to psychological manipulation. Cultural appeals to sentiment and nostalgia do not override tactical discipline. Traditional methods, isolation, deprivation, legal threats, similarly fail to produce cooperation. Watanabe's conclusion recommended abandoning sophisticated psychological techniques in favor of simple, indefinite detention. Keep prisoners alive as potential exchange subjects. Extract intelligence only from captured equipment and documents. Accept that trained military personnel would resist all interrogation methods short of torture, which violated international law and risked retaliation. Japanese intelligence officers debated the recommendation throughout 1943. Some argued for harsher methods, torture disguised as necessary wartime interrogation. Others pointed out that American treatment of Japanese prisoners was relatively humane. Escalating to torture would justify American retaliation and create worse conditions for captured Japanese personnel. The debate remained unresolved until August 1945, when Japan's surrender ended all prisoner interrogations. Watanabe survived the war and worked as a translator during the American occupation. In a 1947 interview with U.S. Army historians, he reflected on the Thanksgiving interrogation. "I underestimated their discipline. I thought nostalgia would override military training. I was wrong. American airmen demonstrated remarkable psychological resistance. The Thanksgiving feast should have created emotional vulnerability. Instead, it increased their suspicion. They recognized manipulation immediately. I learned that sophisticated interrogation techniques work only when the subject wants to cooperate. Against determined resistance, sophistication is irrelevant." The interview concluded with Watanabe's assessment of the Doolittle Raiders' resistance. 8 men maintained silence for 7 months. 3 died rather than speak. 5 survived but revealed nothing of tactical value. From an intelligence perspective, my assignment was complete failure. From a human perspective, I witnessed extraordinary courage. Robert Hayes returned to Terre Haute in September 1945. He weighed 92 pounds, suffered from chronic dysentery and malnutrition-related complications, and carried psychological trauma from 40 months of captivity. The Army offered him a medical discharge with full disability benefits. He accepted and enrolled at Indiana State Teachers College on the GI Bill, earning a degree in history by 1949. He taught high school history in Terre Haute for 33 years, from 1949 to 1982. He married in 1950, had 3 children, and lived in a modest house 3 blocks from his childhood home. He attended Presbyterian church services every Sunday and coached varsity basketball for 15 years. He never spoke publicly about the Thanksgiving interrogation. His family knew he had been a POW, but understood that the subject was closed to discussion. His wife learned basic details, captured after the Doolittle Raid, held in Shanghai, liberated by Soviet forces. But Hayes refused to elaborate beyond essential facts. In 1972, a history graduate student researching POW experiences contacted Hayes requesting an interview. Hayes agreed to one meeting, during which he confirmed dates, locations, and basic timeline, but declined to discuss interrogation methods or psychological experiences. "What happened in that prison stays in that prison," Hayes told the student. "The men who died there deserve privacy. Their families don't need to know how Japan tried to break us. It's enough to know we didn't break." The graduate student published a dissertation about Doolittle Raid survivors that included 2 paragraphs about Hayes's captivity, based entirely on official Army records. Hayes never read it. In 1982, Hayes retired from teaching. He volunteered at the Wabash Valley Veterans Museum, cataloging World War II artifacts and helping other veterans access VA benefits. He gave presentations to high school students about the importance of studying history, but never mentioned his own service beyond basic facts. In 1992, the 50th anniversary of the Doolittle Raid, Hayes attended a reunion of surviving raiders in Los Angeles. 18 men remained alive from the original 80 who had launched from USS Hornet on April 18, 1942. They gathered for a formal dinner, toasted their fallen comrades, and shared private memories. At the reunion, Hayes met Jacob DeShazer, another prisoner from Shanghai who had survived captivity. The 2 men spoke briefly about their shared experience, the first time Hayes had discussed it with anyone in 47 years. "You remember Thanksgiving 1942?" DeShazer asked. "I remember," Hayes said. "You think Watanabe knew it would backfire? That the feast would make us more suspicious instead of more cooperative?" Hayes considered the question. "I think he believed what he'd learned at Stanford, that Americans are sentimental and nostalgic. He was right. We are sentimental. But he didn't understand that sentiment and discipline aren't opposites. We loved Thanksgiving. We loved everything it represented. That's exactly why we wouldn't let him use it against us." "Never thought about it that way," DeShazer said. "Neither did Watanabe," Hayes replied. "That's why he failed." Hayes died in 1997 at age 79 from complications related to malnutrition-related organ damage sustained during captivity. His funeral was attended by 200 people, former students, fellow teachers, veterans, family. The eulogy mentioned his service as a Doolittle Raider and POW, but provided no details about interrogation or resistance. Among his personal effects, Hayes's family found a small wooden box containing 8 hand-carved figurines, rough representations of men made from bamboo splinters, created during his imprisonment in Shanghai. 8 men. 8 Doolittle Raiders held in Jiangwan Prison, 3 executed, 5 survived. His daughter donated the figurines to the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where they are displayed in the Doolittle Raid exhibit with a placard reading, "Carved by Lieutenant Robert Hayes, POW, 1942 to 1945. Memorial to captured raiders." No mention of Thanksgiving, no description of psychological interrogation, just 8 small figures representing courage, silence, and survival. November 26, 1942, a Japanese intelligence officer tried to break American prisoners using nostalgia, cultural manipulation, and sophisticated psychological techniques. He served them roasted duck, spoke about Thanksgiving traditions, appealed to their sentiment and homesickness. 8 men recognized the game. 8 men maintained silence. 3 died for that silence. 5 survived without revealing tactical secrets that might have cost more American lives. The Thanksgiving feast wasn't kindness. It was interrogation theater. But it failed because the prisoners understood something Commander Watanabe didn't. Loving your country and honoring your traditions doesn't make you vulnerable. It makes you stronger. Hayes and his fellow raiders sat in Japanese custody, thousands of miles from home, facing execution, isolated from each other, subjected to months of psychological pressure. They could have justified cooperation. They could have rationalized that Japan would eventually extract the information anyway from captured equipment. They could have traded technical details for better treatment, medical care, survival. They chose silence instead. History records the Doolittle Raid's tactical success. 16 bombers striking Tokyo, forcing Japan to recall forces from the Pacific to defend the homeland, boosting American morale after Pearl Harbor. But history should also record what happened afterward, in Shanghai's prison cells, when 8 men refused to let psychological warfare succeed where military force had failed. Final statistics: 8 Doolittle Raiders captured, 7 months interrogation, 0 tactical intelligence provided, 3 executed, 5 survived. Watanabe's sophisticated psychological approach, complete failure. Hayes's simple resistance strategy, complete success. If this story moved you, remember that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes courage is sitting in a cell, eating roasted duck and saying nothing except name, rank, and serial number. Sometimes courage is recognizing manipulation and refusing to yield even when yielding seems reasonable. Sometimes courage is protecting your brothers by remaining silent about Thanksgiving.